Okay, so in today's video, we are going to start into biology and learning about how we classify living things. So we are going to start talking about the different characteristics of life. How do we know that something is living? And from there, we can start to unpack how these living things exist. So the first thing to note is that in biology, there's going to be a lot of vocab words, and there's going to be a lot of big words that you may not understand the meaning. So I like to go through and I like to break down the words into their little parts, into their components, so that we can better understand what they mean and how they apply to what we're learning. So the first we're gonna look at is biology, and biology is the study of life. So we see this prefix bio here. Bio is life. So when you see ology, the suffix here, ology is the study of. So if you've ever seen geology or astrology or different things like that, those are different studies. So we are studying something. And in this case, we are studying life. But how do we know that something's alive? In order to do that, we need to look at its characteristics. What can it do that we have decided makes it living? So there are 8 characteristics we are going to talk about. I've seen some of these lumped together, so it can vary, but in this case, we're going to say that there are 8. And in order for something to be living, it must have all 8 of these characteristics. So all 8 of these characteristics that we're going to go through will be found in every living organism. So the first one is that all living things are made up of cells. So cells are the basic unit of life. So we don't classify anything as living until we hit the stage of cell. Some living things are going to be unicellular. Uni means one, so unicellular means single-celled. Others are going to be multicellular, which means that they are composed of many and multiple different cells. And the cells can also be prokaryotic. Prokaryotic means that they have no nucleus. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Or they can be eukaryotic. Eukaryotic means that they do have a nucleus. A couple examples you've probably seen before. So bacteria are unicellular prokaryotes. They have no nucleus. While things like blood cells or plant cells, these are leaf cells in particular, are going to be eukaryotic because they do have a nucleus. So all of these are cells, all of these make up living things. The second stage, or the second characteristic, is that all living things show organization. So organization, when we talk about that, we mean things like complexity. How can we put a bunch of little things together to get a big thing? So all living things are going to show increased complexity. So typically when we look at this organization, we go from the smallest, the most simple, to the biggest and the most complex. So for example, if we were to look at the organization of organisms, we start out with cells. Cells are the first thing that we would classify as living. Cells are grouped together to form tissues. Those tissues are grouped together to form organs. Those organs group together to form organ systems, and then those organ systems group together to form organisms. So it's kind of like playing with Legos. If you've ever played with Legos before, all of these little pieces come together to form a larger structure with a common function. So if I build a fire truck or an airplane out of these Legos, all of those Legos have come together to make that one object or that one mechanism. So all of them are going to work together to form the whole. Characteristic number 3, all living things need to obtain and use energy and other needed materials. So energy is going to be one of the big ones for this. So all living things need energy. You usually get energy in the morning from your breakfast. We need it to stay alive, and we need to carry out our metabolism. Our metabolism is all of the different chemical reactions that are happening within our body. So all of the reactions to break down our food, to produce new cells, to move different molecules, all of them require energy, and all of them need to work within our metabolism just so that we can keep ourselves going. And we can get this in many different ways. So plants absorb sunlight to get their energy. We'll talk about that when we talk about photosynthesis. Humans and other organisms, like this cow down here, obtain energy through eating different things. So the cow will eat the grass, we will eat the cow, and we get our energy from what we consume. Other organisms that we'll talk about a little bit later get their chemical energy from chemicals found underground or in thermal vents, especially when they don't have access to sunlight. In terms of using energy, we can use it for many different things. Like I said, carrying out the reactions in our body, moving different molecules as well, but as well as larger scale actions like moving. All organisms do move, even things like plants move. Hunting, gathering, all of those require energy, so we have to use that energy to keep ourselves going. Characteristic number 4, all living things maintain a stable internal environment. So all of the different factors in your body, so temperature, pH, oxygen levels, water levels, waste, that sort of thing, need to be controlled so that we can maintain ourselves and keep ourselves consistently going. And we call this homeostasis. So homeostasis is the process of maintaining a stable internal environment. This is a vocab word that you will definitely want to remember because it will pop up many times throughout the semester. So homeostasis is the act or the process of maintaining or keeping a consistent, stable internal environment. Now we can do this in a lot of ways. If we use the example of temperature, if you get too hot, your body will start to sweat, as you can see in the picture over here. So sweating releases water onto the surface of your skin. That water absorbs the heat from your skin and evaporates. And what that does is it cools you down. It takes that heat with it to cool your body down. If it gets too cold, you'll start to shiver. Your muscles will try to warm themselves up through movement, and that will try to raise your body temperature back up to about 98.6 on average. Other organisms, though, don't necessarily have that luxury. We are ectotherms, which means we release heat, but other organisms don't have that luxury. Some of them, like reptiles, need sunlight to warm themselves up. So, for example, these turtles are basking on a log, trying to warm their bodies up to be able to maintain homeostasis. They start to get sick if they don't have that sunlight to warm themselves up, which is also why if you ever keep reptiles as a pet, you have to use heat lamps to provide them with that heat, especially if they don't get access to sunlight. The next characteristics is that all living things reproduce. So the goal of all organisms is to pass on your traits to the next generation, to have offspring that will continue on the species and avoid extinction. So all organisms want to pass their genes down to the next generation. So you can see the lemurs up here. The traits that mom has here were passed on to the offspring. And this passing down of traits is going to be contained in genetics. So all organisms have DNA, which is their hereditary information. We will spend an entire couple units talking about DNA and what we use it for. And all of the DNA found in all of the organisms on the planet is the same. We all have the same coding between ourselves. It's just used in different ways. So DNA was discovered by a couple scientists, Watson, Crick, and Rosalind Franklin was another big help. They were the ones who discovered the actual structure of DNA and got it put together. We've since done a lot of research into kind of mapping it and figuring out where different genes are located and how they get passed down over time. And you can see variation in everyone around you. Some people may look more similar to you than others because their traits were passed down and maybe common traits were passed down. You can also see this in siblings. These are the Kardashians, and you can see even though they are all related and although there has been some physical altering through different surgeries and things like that, they all have a lot of similar characteristics. Now, when we talk about this reproduction, we can do it in one of two ways. We can either do it through sexual reproduction, which involves crossing the egg and sperm to form a new offspring. So typically this happens between two individuals, at least in a lot of animals. In a lot of plants, this can happen on the same plant. A lot of flowers will have both male and female reproductive parts on the same plant. But as long as we are combining egg and sperm to get a new offspring, this is going to be considered sexual reproduction. So we will talk about this when we talk about cell division. But these offspring, because they are crossing the sperm and egg of one or two different organisms, maybe more, there is going to be a lot of variability. Different traits will be crossed from different organisms that may give new traits to the offspring. So for example, if we have a parent that has blue eyes, has a child with a person who has green eyes, then the child, if the traits are passed down, the child may be more likely to have green eyes because green eyes are dominant. We can, however, have instances where we don't have egg and sperm, yet we produce an offspring. And this is called asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is going to create copies of the original parent because we're not having that egg and sperm combination. We're just having one organism passing down their traits. So in unicellular organisms like bacteria, we usually see this in the process of binary fission. So we have one cell splitting in half to form two identical daughter cells. But in nature, we do find this a lot in larger organisms as well. This is a Brunaria borealis, a type of grass mantis. This species only has females. There are no males of the species, and this species reproduces parthenogenically, which means that they reproduce and all of the offspring are going to be females. So this is a girl, and all of her children will be girls as well. The next characteristic is that living things respond to their environment. So in order to respond to your environment, you need two things. You need a stimulus and you need a response. So a stimulus is a change in the environment that's going to cause some sort of a reaction. So if, for example, you turn off the lights, your eyes will start to adjust. So the change in the environment is going to be that stimulus. How you react or how an organism reacts is the response. So the response is going to be a reaction to the stimulus. For example, if you walk outside and it's 30 degrees, your body will respond by shivering. Or if you walk outside and it's 100 degrees, your body will respond by sweating. Other examples, eyes dilating. So again, if you get really bright light or you get really dark light, your eyes will adjust to be able to see in those conditions. Plants will move in accordance to where the sun is. You can see this especially in plants that don't receive a lot of sunlight. This is called etiolation or stretching. You can also see this in sunflowers that follow the pattern of the sun throughout the day. So these are all responses to some sort of stimulus. In this case, light for both of these. You can also condition responses. So, for example, a researcher named Pavlov back in Russia in, I believe, the 1800s, learned that stimulus and responses could be conditioned in dogs. So he would ring a bell and pair that stimulus with feeding the dog. The response was that the dog would salivate. It would start to slobber because it thinks it's getting food. And after training that condition, or those conditions, it learned to associate the bell with food. So even when he rang the bell and didn't feed it, the dog would still think that it was going to get fed. So these conditions can be controlled and can be implemented into different organisms. The next characteristic is that all living things grow and develop. So growth is just an increase in size, the amount of cells or the increase in cell size. So unicellular organisms, typically the one cell will just get bigger. In multicellular organisms, this is going to be increasing in number of cells. So going from 2 cells to 4 cells, or going from 100 cells to 200 cells. Development, on the other hand, is a period of change in the organism. So typically we see changes in physiology, changes in hormones, changes in chemicals, changes in reproductive availability. So for example, human puberty would be an example of development, because we are going from a younger stage into a stage of sexual maturity. In plants, you can see this a lot whenever they start to develop flowers, switching from growth phase into that flowering and reproductive phase. A great example of reproduction and growth, though, is butterflies. So if you've ever raised butterflies, you've probably seen both of these in action. So butterflies hatch out of an egg and start as caterpillars. This is actually a blue morpho from South America. And as the caterpillar starts to get older, and as it eats more, it will get bigger. So this we would consider growth. At a certain point, however, the caterpillar will stop eating and instead turn itself into a chrysalis. The chrysalis is kind of a stationary capsule from which the caterpillar will transform into a butterfly. So it goes through some morphological changes in this chrysalis that allows it to go into the butterfly stage. So this will be a stage of development. Caterpillars cannot reproduce, butterflies can. So we are going from a stage of sexual immaturity to sexual maturity. And number 8, as a whole, all living things adapt to their environment. They change over time. So typically these changes are going to happen over many generations. It's not going to be a single organism. That would be an example of acclimation, not adaptation. So in this case, we are trying to select for characteristics or behaviors that help us to survive or help us to do something. So these selective pressures could be things like predation, habitat, competition, introduced species. All of those are going to account for different traits that will help them to be better suited for that environment. And those that don't survive will end up going extinct. You can see this if you've ever seen fossils. Fossils show lots of organisms that have gone extinct. This is a coral that I believe is no longer living, as well as a bunch of seashells. But species that are not able to adapt will go extinct. You can also see the example of the dinosaurs over here are no longer living. They went extinct, and instead their ancestors, birds, have kind of continued on with any legacy that they may have had. So the last thing we're going to talk about is we're going to look a little bit into cells. We will go in further. We'll have an entire unit devoted to cells and cell parts, but I want to at least preface, because these are 2 other things that will be repeated a lot throughout the semester. That's the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So prokaryotes are things like bacteria and archaea that are very simple, very small, and are typically unicellular and have no nucleus. Now, what do I mean by nucleus? A nucleus is a capsule within the center-ish of the cell, and its job is to contain DNA. All of our genetic material is stored within that nucleus. So prokaryotes have no nucleus. Instead, they have a central area where their DNA is stored. Typically, this is a ring of DNA called a plasmid or a nucleoid. And this is just going to be kept within the middle of the cell and accessed whenever it's necessary. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, are going to be things like plants, animals, fungi, so mushrooms, protists, other pond organisms, as well as us, we are all eukaryotes. And eukaryotes can exist both as unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms. And the trick with them is that they do have a nucleus. So you can see in the middle here, this large, kind of looks like a wiffle ball to me, is the nucleus, and that is where we are going to store all of our DNA. So you'll see this in examples like this. This is a picture of plant cells. You can see these dark circles here are nucleus, or nuclei in this case. So each cell has one nucleus that it stores its DNA in. So the trick I use to kind of remember the difference between these two is that pro rhymes with no, so pro has no nucleus. Eukaryotes do have a nucleus. So u rhymes with do, or u rhymes with true. So eukaryotes have a true nucleus. You'll also notice that prokaryotes have no organelles. Organelles are these little structures within the cell that allow it to do certain functions. So prokaryotes have no organelles. Eukaryotes do. So if you've ever heard of the mitochondria, that is an organelle that we will talk about. Like I said, we have an entire unit devoted just to cellular structure and how do cells work, but we will look further at them in this case. But prokaryotes, no nucleus, no organelles. Eukaryotes have a nucleus and they have organelles. They're a lot more complex than prokaryotes. Okay, so that's where we are going to end it for today. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll see you in class.